When we talk about personal relationships, it's important that we also address controlling and abusive personal relationships and what that looks like for people. It unfortunately happens all too often. We call this the dark side of communication anytime we have very negative and violent communication interactions, but particularly within interpersonal communication related to um, couples, families, friends. So we refer to this as abuse, or also intimate partner violence, which is referred to as IPV. And some stats for you. Women ages 20 to 24 are at the greatest risk of becoming victims of domestic violence. More than 4 million women experience physical assault and rape by their partners. 1 in 3 female homicide victims are murdered by their current or former partner every year. Domestic violence is the third leading cause of homelessness among families, according to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So although we often see images of old homeless men, often there's a lot of much younger women and children also on the streets for lack of other places to go. More than 3 million children witness domestic violence in their homes every year. Children who live in homes where there's domestic violence also suffer abuse or neglect at high rates of 30 to 60%. Every year, more than 3 million reports of child abuse are made in the United States, involving more than 6 million children, and a report of child abuse is made every 10 seconds. Estimates currently state that 1 in 10 women in the U.S. will be sexually assaulted within her lifetime, and during the college years on college campuses, those rates go up to about 1 in 4. Men are also abused and victims of intimate partner violence, but we don't have the statistics in the same way that we do for women because our stats for any category are underreported. For men in particular, they're underreported because of social expectations of what's okay to happen to men, so often they're not reported, and we also are only slowly gathering facts about rates of violence within LGBT relationships. It's just not statistics that were collected for a very long time. Down at the bottom of the page are 2 websites you can go to for more resources. We also have examples of non-physical abuse. So there are a lot of behaviors that qualify as emotional or verbal abuse, and you'll also hear the term psychological abuse. I mentioned that physical abuse is underreported. Non-physical abuse is far much more so. A lot of people don't understand, don't know that they're being abused because often our community does not define abuse. We don't see images of abuse as verbal or emotional. We more likely are seeing the physical ones, and so it's a common refrain to say, well, I didn't know I was being abused because I was never hit, right? And so we've come to define that being hit piece as abuse when really many, many other types can happen. So calling you names and putting you down, yelling and screaming at you, intentionally embarrassing you in public, preventing you from seeing or talking with friends and family, telling you what to do and where, using online communities or cell phones to control, intimidate, or humiliate you, blaming your actions for their abusive or unhealthy behavior, stalking you, threatening to commit suicide to keep you from breaking up with them, threatening to harm you, your pet, or people you care about, making you feel guilty or immature when you don't consent to sexual activity, threatening to expose your secrets, such as your sexual orientation or immigration status, being an undocumented worker, or being part of the LGBT community who is not out. Those are very dangerous positions to be in if those are things you have not yet disclosed to others. So threatening to do so is a very violent act. Starting rumors about you, threatening to have your children taken away. So this is not to say that a single action here, a single event, would qualify necessarily as an abusive relationship. It generally takes a pattern of behavior and takes multiple actions, and loveisrespect.org is listed at the bottom as a good resource for this. Another one good to go to is RAINN, R-A-I-N-N. They have a lot of information, and it's worth noting that there are things that don't appear on this list that also count, right? So take some time in the additional resources. There are some resources there to look up, some quizzes to take about what does a physical abuse and non-physical abuse relationship look like, both for myself or my witnessing one. Intimate partner violence, the cycle is talked about in the textbook. It's called the cycle of abuse. Starts with the honeymoon phase, moves to calm, tension builds, there's an explosion, and over time this cycle gets shorter, the explosions get bigger. So I'm going to take a few minutes in this video and have them describe the cycle for us.
People often wonder why someone might stay in an abusive relationship. Because people can't understand why someone might stay in a relationship where their partner is emotionally, verbally, physically, sexually, or abusive in any way, often victim blaming can happen, where people say things like,
I would never let anyone treat me like that. If it was really that bad, she would just leave.
but it is much more complicated than just leaving. If you had to pack up your life today and leave home, where would you go? What would you do? Often in abusive relationships, the abusive partner has a lot of power and control over their partner, so they may be controlling their access to money or have isolated them from friends and family. Abuse rarely happens all the time, so the cycle of violence can help explain the emotions and manipulation that might come into play in an abusive relationship. The cycle of violence includes 4 stages: the tension stage, the violent episode, the honeymoon stage, and the calm stage. In the tension stage, there are a lot of insults, put-downs, threats, and trying to control the other person's behavior. For the person being abused, the tension stage can be described like walking on eggshells. They are trying to avoid doing anything which might set off their abusive partner. But it doesn't matter what they do or don't do. The abusive partner is using this tension to control the person, so no matter what the person does, it could be a trigger for a violent episode. Eventually, the tension explodes into violence. The violent episode can be physical, emotional, sexual, or any other kind of abuse. Ultimately, the abuser is trying to dominate their partner and gain power and control over them. It is a myth that the violent episode happens because of jealousy, anger, fear, or a loss of control. The abusive partner uses the violent episode as a way to gain power and control over their partner. In the honeymoon stage, the abusive partner will be very apologetic, or at least pretend to be. They will say they are sorry and that it will never happen again. They may give gifts, but they may also pretend that the abuse didn't happen, that it was not a big deal, or that it was the person being abused's fault. They may say things like, "If you weren't so stupid, then I wouldn't have to correct you, now would I?" The abuser may even use self-harm or threats of suicide to gain sympathy or to prevent the person being abused from leaving. The abusers are often so convincing, and the person being abused is so eager for the relationship to improve or worn down by the physical and emotional abuse that they will stay in the relationship. In the calm stage, the abusive partner stops acting nice and things go back to normal. The abusive partner may have kept some of their promises, but eventually the tension stage starts again and the cycle repeats itself. As the cycle continues, the calm and the honeymoon stages get shorter and shorter. To review, the cycle of violence has 4 stages: the tension stage, the violent episode, the honeymoon stage, and the calm stage. The Dating Violence Awareness Program was created by Vekova Research Services. This video was made possible with funding from the TELUS Community Fund and the Canadian Women's Foundation.
So here's some more detail on the cycle of violence with some actual examples that might happen. All right, so you can see that this doesn't include the calm stage that would happen around here. And we also have some demonstrations of what's happening with both the batterer and the victim in each of these stages. All right, some examples of phrases. So, things to look for. And I also wanted to point out that there's something that we call the wheel of power and control. And these are ways that abusers exert power and exert control over their victims. And so we have examples of emotional abuse using isolation, using intimidation, using children, minimizing, denying, and blaming, using sexual abuse, using male privilege, using economic abuse, and using coercion and threats. Each here lists some examples which I think are important to see. And while it does say using male privilege, that does not mean that all abusers are male. So it's important to remember that that aspect may or may not come into play. You'll also see that this is primarily for physical and sexual abuse. Friendships can also be toxic. They can be controlling and abusive. Toxic friendships are unsupportive, draining, unrewarding, stifling, unsatisfying, and often unequal. And even long-term friends can shift to negative relationships over time, but we often end up sticking around because of the longevity, which makes them very harmful for us. It's also possible that a toxic friendship may just be temporary, right? Things were good. Here's this intense period of stress this person can't handle. Things are going very, very poorly. Stress is over. Relationship returns, right? It's not healthy to be in that temporarily toxic friendship, but I just want to note that not all toxic friendships are that way from beginning to end. And some very important resources for you in addition to the overview ones that I've listed on the site. Here's the contact information for the DU Health and Counseling Center, for Safe House Denver, which is a safe house for women in the Denver area. And some more legal Colorado resources are available at the address for the link below. Anywhere you see a blank space would actually be an underscore, just as a heads up. I hope these are not relationships that you find yourselves in, but all too often we see them in others, if not ourselves, which is why it's important to be aware of the information and also be aware of the resources to change the situation.